Hello and welcome. Today's programme is all about preserving. It's something I feel quite strongly about. I don't want to see it die out. I want to see it continue. Now, there's all kinds of cooking. There's cooking when you rush home from work and you don't really want to be bothered to cook. We've all been through that. But then there's another kind of cooking when you've got a Saturday afternoon and you've got nothing to do, you can put the radio on and just sort of settle down and do some real creative cooking, and that's preserving time. So, I'm going to have a go at encouraging you. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about equipment for preserving. You don't need a lot, but I'm just going to go through what you do need. It's good if you've got a preserving pan. It's not essential. If you've got a nice big saucepan or a big casserole, that'll be all right. But one word of warning here, don't get one that's too big. This one has got quite a small base to it, and that's very important because when you put it onto a modern hob, you know, the hob's not going to be much bigger than that, so you mustn't have a great big one because it's going to be very hard to get everything up to a good boil. Then you're going to need some preserving jars, and funnily enough, although I would have thought perhaps preserving is dying out, in the shops now you can get loads and loads of jars, and I quite like these here. I think the smaller the better because you want to use a little at a time. But you've got these £1, these are sort of half litres, they're quite good. They go bigger than that, or you can have just ordinary jars that you collect and put in the dishwasher and keep in the cupboard and bring them out when you want to make preserves. It's also a good idea to have a simple little thing like this called a funnel for when you're filling the jars. Also, a couple of other things. You'll need some muslin, or if you haven't got muslin, you can buy this, which is gauze from the chemist. Very easy to buy, to get hold of, and just use, cut off a bit as and when you need it. You need some string, and then you can get these little preserving packs in the shops, and what you get is labels to put on the jars, elastic bands and cellophane, though I'm not keen on cellophane, and these are waxed discs. They're little bits of paper with wax, and when you've filled your preserve into the jar, you put that on and the wax just melts and provides a seal, so that's very important. But we're going to kick off today with the greatest preserve that's ever been invented in the whole wide world. That is good old-fashioned British marmalade. I've got £2 of Seville oranges here, and that, believe it or not, is going to make 6 £1 jars of marmalade. And what you do is settle yourself down, switch the radio on, and just dream away whilst you slice the oranges. First of all, you slice it in half, and I'll just show you what it's like inside because it's actually got lots and lots of pips which are important because this is what's going to help set the marmalade. And what you do is you just squeeze the juice and the pips out, and then you take your empty, just get rid of that pip there, empty cup of peel. You don't worry about all the pith, that's all important, and you cut that into halves, and you need to slice it in thinnish slices because it's very thick, tough skin this, so thinnish slices like that. Now, when you've cut all the peel like that, what happens is the juice and the pips go into the muslin that we talked about earlier. You drape a piece of muslin, a square like this, over a dish, and then you just tie it together in a little bag, put some string round it like that, and then you take it over to your preserving pan, and in here you've got the peel. That's the peel of £2 of Seville oranges. That's the pips and all the debris tied in the muslin. Next thing we're going to do is add 4 pints of water, and I'm going to turn the heat on. 4 pints of water, which is already measured out. And over here I've got all the juice that came out of the oranges, and it's important to remember there's a juice of a lemon here too, because that's going to help with the setting. The good thing about marmalade is you can now go away. You can be at leisure for 2 hours. You bring it up to a simmering point, turn the heat down, let it simmer very, very gently until the peel is cooked, and come back in 2 hours. The principles I'm showing you with marmalade apply to all jams and preserves. So once you know the rules, you could try this apricot and almond conserve. It's delicious spread on hot crumpets on a cold winter's day. With fruit jellies, you have to strain the juice from the fruit. This is cranberry and claret jelly, and it's lovely served slightly spiced to go with chicken or game. Now, 2 hours later, what we need to check is if you look inside the pan here, what you can see is there's a tide mark because the liquid is reduced right down, almost to half its original volume. And then you want to test that the peel is cooked. Again, if the peel isn't cooked properly, it'll be tough when you eat the marmalade. So you just take a piece out and just squeeze it, and it should just fall apart like that, and then you know that it's cooked. Then the next thing you do is take a pair of scissors and remove this bag of pips, and we'll just get the peel that's clinging to it off and put it into the bowl the juice was in. And then the next thing we're going to do is add the sugar. Now, to make 6 pounds of marmalade with 2 pounds of oranges, you need 4 pounds of sugar, and we want to melt it now. So what you do is you actually put the sugar in a low oven for a little while to just warm through, because that's going to help it melt quicker. So the bowl's a bit hot, so I'm going to hold it with a cloth, and then in goes my 4 pounds of sugar. You can use preserving sugar, but it's more expensive and it's extra things to have in the larder, so I don't bother. I just use the sugar that I've got. What you do now is give that a good stir and keep the heat low. We don't want it to simmer. We just want it to be on the lowest heat possible. I'm going to turn it right down. And then the sugar has to melt, and that's going to take about 15 minutes. Stir it 2 or 3 times to allow the sugar to melt completely. So we'll just give that 15 minutes now to allow the sugar to melt. Now, how you test, you've got to get those grains of sugar melted, and how you test that is you just dip this wooden spoon in, then lift it up and look on the back of the wooden spoon, and if they're not melted you can see the little grains there, and you can almost, it's a bit hot, but you can actually touch them and feel them a bit gritty. So what you do is you just keep on. That's not quite ready yet, so we'll just keep on, give it another 2 or 3 minutes. Now I think it's got to be melted by now, so we'll do the test again. It's quite difficult because there are little bits of pith and stuff still sticking to the spoon, but there aren't any grains there now, so we can carry on with the next stage. Now at this stage, what you would do is take 4 little white tea plates, put them into your freezer, and they're going to be used later on to test whether the marmalade is set. But it isn't going to set if we don't put this precious ingredient here. Do you remember this one? This is the bag of pips. Now inside that bag of pips there's lots of pectin, and we want to get it out of there and into the marmalade. Now you can squeeze the bag between 2 plates, but I find it's a bit messy, but I find it's best to do it with your hands. So what I'm going to do now is just give that a good squeeze, and you can see, look, it's all coming out, all that lovely precious pectin, which is going to actually set the marmalade. Now I did tell you this was messy. It is very, very messy, but I've been making marmalade for years, and honestly it's easier than messing about with a couple of plates or a couple of saucers. So now I'm going to get that off my hands and then clean my hands up. And while I'm doing that, I'm just going to tell you that there isn't any way you can buy this in a shop. You can't buy marmalade. Not with that same tangy, lovely, beautiful flavour that just somehow goes so well when you've had bacon and eggs or something, and it's quite rich, and then you get this lovely tangy marmalade afterwards, sort of clear your palate. It's all rather wonderful. Now, we've got the pectin in there, so what I'm going to do is just switch to a whisk now and just whisk the pectin into the rest. And now we come to the grand finale, which is how to set the marmalade. And what we're going to do, put it back on the heat, like that, and turn the heat right up to its highest setting. And what we need to do now is get that up to a very fast or rolling boil and give it 15 minutes, then remove it from the heat and do the first test for a set. So, you take a teaspoonful of marmalade, put it onto your plate, and it's going to look really liquid now. Put it back in the freezer. When it's really cold, we can do the test. It'll take 2 or 3 minutes to cool down. Right, so the way to test if the marmalade is set is it's cooled now, and if you just push it like that, what you see is very fine little crinkles on the skin. And also, when you lift your finger up, you can see there, look, how that's definitely set. That's now marmalade. If you find when you've got a set in your marmalade, there's a bit of scum on the top, don't worry about it. Don't spoon it off because you'll lose the precious marmalade. You can put a tiny little knob of butter in, about half a teaspoonful, and that'll disperse the scum if you've got too much. Otherwise, just give it a sort of a whisk, and that can probably disperse it as well. Now, I've got to tell you, very, very important part of preserving. Listen to this carefully. You must put your preserves in sterilised jars. And how you sterilise a jar, I've got one sitting here, and it's hot. And let me just explain what you do, is you wash them in warm soapy water, rinse them in hot water, then put them on a baking tray and pop them into a medium oven for about 5 minutes, and that will totally sterilise them. So now we're ready to pop the marmalade, and you'll see why we needed that lovely funnel when we were looking at the equipment. And then just use a ladle, fill the hot jar, and make sure it comes right up to the top. You might have to sort of just juggle a little bit, just to make sure it comes right up to the top. I think that could just have a tiny bit more in. There we go. You mustn't have a gap, an air gap there. And then what you need to do is put the little wax disc on the top, and the wax will melt and provide a seal. Put the lid on straight away so that it's perfectly sealed, and then that's your marmalade ready. You've only got to do one more thing now, and that's put a label on it. But don't put the label on it now because it'll fall off. Wait till it's absolutely cold and then label it. That is marmalade, whatever year you're making it in. One of the great things about preserving is watching out for those brief seasons when the fruit is available. And the next recipe uses a fruit that's only around for a couple of weeks at the beginning of September. Well, what I've just shown you in making marmalade are really all the principles you'll ever need to know if you want to make fruit preserves, jams, etc. But now we're going to move on, and I'm going to show you the basic principles when you want to make a chutney. And the chutney I'm going to make is actually, in my own personal belief, the very best chutney in the world. And that's Damson Chutney, made with absolutely beautiful fruit. I think damsons, I can't praise them highly enough. They're wonderful in jam, and they're also absolutely wonderful in chutney. And we're going to make Damson Chutney. And first of all, we're going to use 3 pounds of damsons. And what I've got to do is explain to you how to prepare them. And you've got 2 choices here. The first one is that you take a damson and remove the stone. And what you do is just take the knife down the natural line of the plum and slice it in half. And then you give it a little twist like that, so it comes in half. And then you eke out the pip like that. Now, if you've got 3 pounds of damsons, that can be quite fiddly and quite tedious. It'll probably take about 25 minutes. But actually, if you switch the radio on and you just sit and dream, and it's actually quite relaxing, really. It's not that bad. The other choice is you can cook the damsons, and when the stones begin to leave the flesh, you can sort of fish them out. And I would say that probably would take a bit longer. So I'd go for this, if you've got the patience, I'd go for this kind. So let's move on now. What I've got here are the 3 pounds of damsons that have been already stoned. And I'm going to take them over and put them into the preserving pan, which is just exactly the same kind of preserving pan that we used on the marmalade. So in go the damsons. And then really, all that happens now is all the other ingredients just go in one by one. So I'll explain them as we go through. First of all, we've got 3 large onions, and these have been chopped quite finely in the food processor, so that wasn't too hard. And then next, I've got apples, and these have been chopped in the food processor again, with the skin still left on. They're cored but not peeled, and they've turned a little bit brown. You can't help that, but it's not going to matter because the colour is going to disappear into the wonderful, vibrant colour of the damsons. So that's something we don't need to worry about. Next ingredient is raisins, and I've got 1 pound of lovely juicy raisins here, so I'm going to put those in. And just a few there that have escaped. And sugar. And I've got 2 kinds of sugar here, 1 pound of each, dark soft brown sugar and demerara sugar. And that's next. Then we've got salt, and I've got 2 tablespoons of salt here, so that goes in next. And that's lovely rock salt. Ginger, and I found that in making chutneys, I prefer to use dried ginger for chutneys. So this is dried ginger, and this is 1 heaped tablespoon of dried ginger. So that's going next. And then I've got 3 cloves of garlic. They've been ready crushed for me. And lastly, spices. Now the spices I'm using are whole spices. I've got allspice berries, cinnamon sticks and cloves. And just like we did with the pips in the marmalade, they're going to be tied in gauze or muslin and suspended into the chutney in exactly the same way, tying a little bow here through the handle. I've always thought of chutney as being a very, very English thing, and indeed we have a great tradition of making chutneys here. But of course, it's not really English. It came along with the traders from India in the 18th century, so we got the idea from India. But I think we've carried on, you know, inventing our own chutneys, and now I do think it is quite British, really. Now we're going to put vinegar in, and I've got 2 pints of vinegar here, and this is good old-fashioned malt vinegar, and that's what you need when you make a chutney. No smart vinegars here. You need the good old-fashioned kind. And then all we're going to do is we're going to turn the heat on, give this all a really good stir, and it'll take quite a while now for that to actually come up to a simmer, because as you can see, there's a very, very big quantity here, because all this together is going to give us 6 pounds in the end of chutney. And so what's going to happen now is that's going to come up to the boil, and then the heat will go down, and it's going to simmer very, very gently. Then you can go away, do other things, come back and give it a stir from time to time, and then in 2.5 hours we can have a look to see how to tell whether a chutney is cooked or not. When you get towards the end of the 2.5 hours, you need to stir it a bit more often so that it doesn't catch on the base. And here we go, just like with the marmalade, you can see the tide mark. It's reduced down and down and down. And the way to test if the chutney is ready to put into the jars is terribly simple and terribly easy. Pull the wooden spoon across the chutney and make a channel. And if the channel fills with vinegar, then you need to give it a bit longer. So the chutney's ready. Now I'm going to turn the heat off, and we're going to, again, pour it into hot, sterilised jars. And this time, you can either make 6 pounds or 4 half-litre jars like this. This is a half-litre jar. If you want to make chutney is present, it's a good idea to use the pound jam jars. Now while I'm filling the jar, I've got to tell you the bad news about chutney, and that is you've got to keep it for 3 months before you can eat it, which I know is going to be very difficult. But that's because in the beginning the vinegar tastes really harsh, and after 3 months in a cool, dark place, the chutney will mellow and you'll get a beautiful flavour coming through, but try not to even taste it until the 3 months is up. But again, the rules are the same. You've got to fill it right up to the neck. We're going to just pop a little bit more on there because I want it right to the top so there's no gap. And then I'm going to use 2 wax discs because this is a bigger gap at the top here, just to make sure it's sealed. And all I can tell you is that you can only make this in the autumn, end of